fan of $100 bills fluttered between them like a magician's trick. Officer Sarah Dawson's eyes reflected the green currency as it passed from his hand to hers, vanishing into her uniform pocket with practiced efficiency. She'd performed this sleight of hand dozens of times before a dance, as familiar as buckling her duty belt. "Thanks for understanding my situation, officer," the man said, his expensive cologne mixing with the night air. "Those points would have cost me my license." "Drive safely, Mr. Reynolds," Sarah replied, handing back his license without the promised speeding ticket. "Slow down next time." The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, catching the lingering touch of their hands. 3 unmarked vehicles suddenly swarmed around them, light bars illuminating from dashboards. "Police! Hands where we can see them." The world exploded into motion. Sarah's face froze in shock as 4 officers from Internal Affairs emerged from the vehicles. The man Reynolds was already on his knees, hands raised. "Officer Sarah Dawson, you're under arrest for soliciting and accepting a bribe," announced Detective Harmon, a veteran from IA whom Sarah had nodded to dozens of times in the precinct hallways. "You have the right to remain silent." As the cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists, Sarah realized with sickening clarity that Reynolds wasn't just another wealthy businessman willing to pay for leniency. He was the bait in a trap that had been waiting to spring for months. She caught a glimpse of Captain Reeves watching from one of the unmarked cars, his face a mask of disappointment. Next to him sat Chief Williams, whose campaign against departmental corruption had dominated the last year. Sarah was about to become his latest trophy. "I can explain," she started, but Detective Harmon tightened the cuffs. "Save it for interrogation, Dawson. You've said enough on our recordings." The words hit like physical blows. Recordings. They had been watching her. For how long? 6 months earlier, Sarah had arrived at the 32nd precinct with an unblemished record and mounting debt. Medical bills from her mother's cancer treatments had piled up faster than her salary could manage. 3 months of double shifts hadn't made a dent in the 75,000 owed to the hospital. Her mother, Eleanor Dawson, had been a kindergarten teacher for 30 years before the diagnosis. No health insurance plan had been comprehensive enough to cover the experimental treatments that might have given her a fighting chance. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Her mother had shaped the futures of hundreds of children, only to find society unwilling to invest in hers. Sarah had been assigned to traffic patrol along Commerce Avenue, a stretch of road where the affluent residents of Westlake Hills frequently tested the performance capabilities of their luxury vehicles. Her partner, Officer Mike Brennan, had been with the department for 15 years. "Got another one," Mike called out as the radar gun registered 67 and a 45. "Black Audi, let's go!" Sarah hit the lights, pulling the cruiser into traffic. The Audi slowed obediently, easing to the curb. "I'll take this one," Mike said, grabbing the ticket book. "You can observe." The driver, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, didn't seem concerned as Mike approached. Sarah watched from the passenger seat, observing the standard procedure until it wasn't. The man passed something to Mike, who slipped it into his pocket before returning to the cruiser without issuing a citation. "What happened to the ticket?" Sarah asked as they pulled back into traffic. Mike shrugged. "Guy was having a bad day. Just gave him a warning." But later, in the bathroom, Sarah glimpsed Mike counting out several $100 bills from his wallet. He caught her eye in the mirror and hesitated. "Look," he said finally, "we're all just trying to get by. The brass gets their kickbacks from the city. The politicians get theirs from the developers. Why shouldn't we get something too?" Sarah said nothing, but that night, as she stared at another hospital bill marked "Final Notice," Mike's words echoed in her mind. She called the hospital billing department the next day during her lunch break. The woman on the other end of the line spoke with practiced sympathy. "I understand your situation, Miss Dawson, but the hospital has already been quite lenient. Without payment, we'll have to transfer your mother to the county facility." Sarah had visited the county hospital once for a domestic violence call. The overcrowded wards, understaffed nurses' stations, and pervasive smell of industrial disinfectant haunted her memories. "She'll die there," Sarah said. "I'm sorry." replied the voice, already moving on to the next call. Sarah sat in her patrol car afterward, watching traffic flow past each vehicle, a potential source of the money she desperately needed. Her moral compass, once pointing unwaveringly toward justice, began to waver. The first time was 2 weeks later. A woman in a Mercedes, her breath smelling of expensive wine, hinted that perhaps they could work something out. Sarah found herself with $500 and a cold feeling in her stomach that she tried to ignore. That night, she made a payment on her mother's hospital bill, enough to buy another month of care. She told herself it would be just this once-in-emergency measure. But emergencies have a way of becoming routine. A doctor recommended an additional course of treatment not covered by insurance. The roof of her mother's house began to leak. The ancient furnace failed during the coldest week of winter. Each time, Sarah found a reason, a justification. Each time, the line she promised herself she wouldn't cross moved a little further away. It got easier after that. Soon, she developed an instinct for which drivers might be willing to pay their way out of trouble. She was careful never taking bribes when dash cameras were operational, varying her locations, keeping the amounts reasonable. There were rules she maintained, principles that separated her in her own mind from being truly corrupt. She never took money from drunk drivers, never looked the other way on moving violations that put others at risk, never gave breaks to those carrying drugs or weapons. These self-imposed boundaries allowed her to sleep at night, to look at herself in the mirror each morning as she pinned on the badge that grew heavier with each passing day. Within 4 months, she had paid off her mother's medical debt. The treatment seemed to be working. Eleanor's color improved, and she gained back some of the weight she'd lost. Sarah should have stopped then, but the money had become a solution to every problem, a balm for the stress of the job, compensation for the long hours, and miserable pay. When Mike invited her to join a group of officers who maintained a network of local businesses willing to pay for enhanced protection, she didn't immediately refuse. The extra $1,000 a month would allow her mother to try an immunotherapy treatment her oncologist had mentioned as a last resort. "It's just insurance," Mike explained over beers at the Blue Line, a bar favored by cops from their precinct. "We make sure their neighborhoods get extra patrols. They make sure we can afford to live in this overpriced city. Everybody wins." Sarah nursed her beer, watching Mike interact with others from their shift. Rodriguez, Patel, Wilkinsall nodding along, all presumably part of this arrangement. "What about IA?" she asked quietly. Mike laughed. "Internal Affairs is too busy chasing actual criminals in the department. The higher-ups don't care about this nickel-and-dime stuff as long as nobody gets greedy or sloppy." She joined their network the following week. The money flowed more steadily. Now predictable envelopes slipped into her hand during routine checks of local businesses. She never suspected that Internal Affairs had been building a case against her for months. "You've been unusually quiet, Dawson," Detective Harmon said from across the interview table. The interrogation room was deliberately uncomfortable, hard chairs, bright lights, and a persistent chill that seeped into the bones. Sarah stared at the folder in front of Harmon, which she knew contained evidence of her crimes. Next to him sat Agent Keller from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, whose presence indicated the seriousness of the investigation. "I want a lawyer," she said, her voice barely audible. "Smart. You'll need one." Harmon opened the folder. "We have you on video accepting bribes on 7 separate occasions. Your bank records show cash deposits totaling over $30,000 in the past 6 months. And tonight, our undercover officer handed you marked bills that we've already recovered from your pocket." Keller leaned forward. "We're not just looking at you, Dawson. We know about Brennan and the others, the protection racket, the kickbacks from the businesses on your beat." Sarah's mind raced. How much did they know? How many officers were implicated? "Does my mother need to know about this?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Harmon's expression softened slightly. "Everyone will know, Sarah. The department is making an example of you. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning. We can offer you a deal," Keller added, sliding a document across the table. "Reduced charges in exchange for your cooperation against the others." The choice was stark. Betray her colleagues or face the full weight of the law alone. In that moment, Sarah realized the true cost of the path she'd chosen, not just the loss of her career, but the corruption of every relationship, every principle she had once valued. "I need to speak with a lawyer," she repeated, pushing the document away. The media frenzy was immediate and merciless. "Officer caught blue-handed," screamed one headline. "Cops corruption funds mother's cancer care," declared another, somehow uncovering the connection between her bribes and her mother's illness. Her formal department photo was splashed across every local news outlet, paired with grainy still frames from the surveillance footage. Her bail was set at 50, zero deliberate echo of her ill-gotten gains. Her mother, frail from chemotherapy but steel-eyed with disappointment, put up their house as collateral. "Why?" was all she asked when Sarah was released. "The hospital bills would have been manageable," her mother interrupted. "We could have worked something out. You didn't have to throw away everything you worked for." The words stung, because they contained the truth Sarah had refused to acknowledge. There had been other options, payment plans, medical charity programs, downsizing the house. Difficult choices, but honest ones. "I just wanted to give you a fighting chance," Sarah whispered. Eleanor took her daughter's hand. "At what cost, Sarah? At what cost to you?" The prosecution offered a plea deal: testify against the other officers in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sarah refused. Whatever else she had become, she would not be an informant against the colleagues who had followed the same slippery slope. But it was her former partner who delivered the deepest cut. Mike Brennan, the man who had introduced her to the practice, testified against her in exchange for immunity. "Officer Dawson operated independently," he stated under oath. "I had concerns about her conduct and had reported them to my superiors. The internal affairs records, showing his reports all filed after the investigation into Sarah had begun, were entered into evidence." The others followed suit, presenting a united front that isolated Sarah as a rogue officer acting alone. The protection network dissolved overnight, its members distancing themselves from her with statements of shock and disappointment. As the trial approached, Sarah's attorney, a public defender with bloodshot eyes and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, laid out her options. "They have everything they need to convict you," he explained, shuffling through papers that seemed to multiply with each meeting. "Multiple videos, witness testimony, financial records. If you go to trial, you're looking at 3-5 years minimum. And if I plead guilty, maybe 18 months. Probation after that. But you'd lose your badge permanently. Pension, benefits, everything." Sarah nodded numbly. The badge she'd worked so hard to earn already felt like it belonged to someone else, someone better. 3 days before jury selection, Eleanor collapsed at home. The cancer had spread to her brain. She was admitted to the hospital, the county facility this time, as her insurance had lapsed when Sarah could no longer pay the premiums. Sarah's request to visit was granted under guard supervision. She sat beside her mother's bed, a uniformed officer standing at the door, while monitors beeped a countdown to what the doctors called inevitability. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, holding her mother's thin hand, "for everything." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. "No more apologies," she managed. "Just promise me something. Anything. Find your way back to the person I raised. She's still in there." Eleanor died the next morning. Sarah entered her guilty plea that afternoon. The courtroom was packed for her sentencing. Former colleagues lined the back wall, their expressions ranging from disappointment to vindictive satisfaction. Captain Reeves, who had pinned the badge on her at graduation 4 years earlier, couldn't meet her eyes. "Officer Dawson," Judge Harriet Coleman began, peering over her glasses, "you have pled guilty to charges of accepting bribes, official misconduct, and betrayal of public trust. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say?" Sarah stood, legs trembling beneath her. She had prepared a statement about her mother's illness, about financial desperation, about a system that expected moral perfection while paying barely enough to survive. But facing the judge, facing the uniform she had disgraced, the words disappeared. "I'm sorry," she managed, voice cracking. "I forgot who I was supposed to be." Judge Coleman's expression remained impassive. The court understands you were facing financial difficulties. Many people do. But most don't have the power that comes with a badge and a gun. Most don't have the authority to enforce laws they themselves are breaking. The judge shuffled her papers. You were entrusted with extraordinary power, and you abused it for personal gain. This court cannot allow such violations to go unpunished. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for the sentence. 30 months in state prison. No possibility of parole until 24 months served. The gavel's crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Rockwell Women's Correctional Facility processed new inmates with mechanical efficiency. Sarah surrendered her civilian clothes, received a medical examination, and was photographed and fingerprinted the latter, an ironic echo of procedures she had performed countless times. Former cop? Asked the intake officer, a heavy-set woman with tired eyes. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Protective custody, then, for your own safety. Protective custody meant 23 hours a day in a cell barely larger than a bathroom. The remaining hour was spent alone in a small exercise yard, watched by guards who had once been colleagues or, worse, respected her authority on the streets. The isolation was both protection and punishment. Sarah's thoughts became her only companions, an endless loop of regret and self-recrimination. She replayed every moment where she could have made a different choice, imagined alternate timelines where her integrity remained intact. Her few possessions included a small photo of her mother in better days, teaching a classroom of children. Sarah taped it to the wall beside her bunk and spoke to it during the long, empty hours, explaining herself, apologizing, seeking absolution from someone who could no longer give it. The only break in the monotony came from her cellmate in the adjacent isolation unit, a woman named Teresa, imprisoned for embezzling from the bank where she had worked as a manager. You steal to feed your kids, Teresa said during one of their shouted conversations through the ventilation system. I stole to pay for my husband's gambling debts. We both thought we were doing it for someone else, but in the end, we're the only ones paying the price. 3 weeks into her sentence, Sarah learned that a foreclosure notice had been posted on her mother's house. Without Sarah's income or insurance, the mortgage had fallen into default. The home where she had grown up, where her mother had lived for 30 years, would be auctioned to the highest bidder. She had no way to stop it, no resources to call upon. The friends who might have helped had disappeared when the handcuffs closed around her wrists. Former colleagues wouldn't take her calls. The system she had once been part of now processed her as just another number. At night, lying on the thin prison mattress, Sarah would close her eyes and imagine herself back in uniform, cruising down familiar streets, waving to shopkeepers who knew her name. The fantasy never lasted. Reality would intrude, harsh and unyielding, reminding her of everything she had lost. After 18 months, Sarah was transferred to general population. Her status as a former police officer had traveled through the prison grapevine ahead of her. She found her mattress slashed on the first day, human waste smeared across her few possessions on the second. We know what you are, whispered an inmate with gang tattoos covering her neck. Crooked pig still smells like bacon. Sarah kept to herself, eating alone, avoiding eye contact, trying to become invisible in a place where attention meant danger. But some debts can't be avoided, and the resentment of those she had helped put behind bars demanded payment. The attack came in the shower. 3 women with improvised Wepansa toothbrush filed to a point, a sock weighted with bars of soap, a piece of metal torn from a bed frame. Sarah's police training helped her fend off the initial assault, but numbers eventually overwhelmed her. When the guards finally responded to the commotion, Sarah lay on the wet tile, blood mixing with water around her unconscious form. She spent 2 weeks in the prison infirmary with 4 broken ribs, a fractured orbital socket, and defensive wounds on her arms and hands. No charges were filed against her attackers. No one had seen anything. The prison chaplain, Father Diaz, visited her in the infirmary. You survived, he said, his weathered face showing genuine concern. That's something. What's the point? Sarah asked, the words slurred through her swollen jaw. There's nothing waiting for me out there. Maybe that's the opportunity, he suggested. to build something new without the expectations of the past. Sarah wanted to believe him, but the path forward seemed obscured by the wreckage of her former life. Each day in prison reinforced the lesson. Trust no one, expect nothing, survive at all costs. She began to lift weights in the yard, not for vanity but for survival. She traded her dessert portions for protection from a group of women who controlled the laundry room. She learned the unwritten rules of prison life, the complex economy of favors and threats that govern their confined world. When another former officer arrived 6 months later, Sarah warned her about the dangers, showed her how to navigate the social hierarchies. It was the closest thing to police work she had done in years. At 31 months, with good behavior time applied, Sarah Dawson was released on probation. She emerged from Rockwell with $157 in gate money, a bus ticket, and the clothes she had worn to her sentencing. The halfway house where she was assigned housed 6 other women, all struggling with the transition back to society. Sarah's parole officer, a man named Gutierrez with perpetually coffee-stained teeth, made it clear that her status as a former officer earned her no special consideration. You check in weekly. You find employment within 30 days. You submit to random drug testing. You miss any of these conditions, you go back to finish your sentence. Are we clear? Sarah nodded. What about jobs? With my record? Not my problem, Gutierrez cut her off. But I suggest you lower your expectations. Way down. He was right. Sarah's criminal record, publicly accessible with a simple internet search, closed doors before she could even knock. Retail positions, restaurant work, customer service all required background checks that she couldn't pass. She applied for a position at a gas station where the manager seemed indifferent to her past. The interview went well until another employee recognized her from the news coverage. "Aren't you that cop who took bribes?" he asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. The manager's expression changed instantly. "I think we've seen enough," he said, gathering her application. "We'll be in touch." They never called. After 3 weeks of rejections, she found work at a car wash, owned by a man who didn't ask questions and paid in cash. The irony wasn't lost on Hirsch, now cleaned the vehicles of people who might have once paid her bribes. The work was physically demanding and poorly paid. Her hands, once wrapped around a service weapon, now cracked and bled from the harsh chemicals. Her back, once straight with pride in her uniform, now ached from bending to scrub wheel wells and undercarriages. Her mother's house had been sold to cover final medical expenses and funeral costs. The few $1,000s that remained had been depleted by the time Sarah was released. With no family, no friends willing to associate with her, and a felony record, Sarah's existence narrowed to survival. The halfway house offered temporary shelter, but the 6-month limit approached quickly. Sarah saved what she could from her car wash earnings, but apartment hunting revealed another reality of her new life. No one wanted to rent to a felon, especially not one whose case had been so public. She eventually found a basement room in a house owned by an elderly woman who was more concerned with Sarah's ability to pay than her past. The room was damp, with pipes running across the ceiling and a small window at ground level that let in more noise than light, but it was shelter. At night, Sarah would sit on the edge of her bed, staring at the faded photo of her mother that had survived prison. "I'm trying," she would whisper. "I'm trying to find my way back." But the path wasn't clear. Each day blended into the next week: work, return to the basement, sleep, repeat. The rhythm of prison had been replaced by a different kind of confinement, one with invisible walls but no less restrictive. 6 months after her release, she passed a police cruiser parked outside a coffee shop. The officer inside, a young woman, about the age Sarah had been when she joined the force, met her eyes briefly before looking away. Sarah saw no recognition there, just the casual assessment of someone who might be a threat or might be nothing at all. She wanted to knock on the window, to warn this officer about the invisible lines that were so easy to cross, about how quickly principles could erode when tested by need or greed or simple opportunity. She wanted to tell her that the uniform promised protection that didn't exist when you betrayed it. Instead, Sarah walked on, head down against the rain that had begun to fall. joining the anonymous crowds of people she had once sworn to protect, and serve people who now moved instinctively away from her, sensing something broken and dangerous in her eyes. On her 30th birthday, a milestone, she had once imagined celebrating with colleagues, perhaps with a promotion to detective on the horizon. Sarah sat alone in a diner, nursing a cup of coffee she could barely afford. A news report played on the television mounted in the corner. Chief Williams stood at a podium, announcing the results of his anti-corruption campaign. Crime was down. Public trust was up. The department had never been cleaner. The camera panned to show Mike Brennan standing among the officers flanking the chief, now wearing sergeant stripes. The man who had introduced her to bribery had been promoted for his cooperation in rooting out corruption. Sarah left without finishing her coffee, the bitter taste in her mouth having nothing to do with the drink. That night, in her basement room, she opened the shoebox where she kept her few remaining possessions. At the bottom, beneath the photo of her mother, lay her service badge, surrendered upon her conviction but returned upon her release no longer, a symbol of authority, just a memento of a life destroyed. She traced the numbers with her finger, remembering the day it had been issued, the pride she had felt, the oath she had taken and broken. The badge was gone. The respect was gone. The future she had planned was gone. And as night fell over the city where she had once patrolled with pride, Officer Sarah Dawson, now just Sarah, now just nobody, appeared into the growing darkness. The price of her choices paid in full, but the debt somehow never settled.